Warm introduction, appreciation to the Center for Security Policy for to Impact America and Breitbart for hosting this gathering, the Uninvited to CPAC. I thought that I would perhaps wrap up or provide a bit of an overview maybe for everything that those who've spoken before me about Ukraine have already touched on so ably. What I think I would say most importantly is that what we are looking at in terms of the Russian takeover of Crimea, and that's what it is, it's a takeover of Crimea, is not happening in an instant. It is not happening in isolation of other events. It is happening along a continuum, a timeline continuum, and a continuum in terms of international relations, the international balance of power, especially, of course, between what we would maybe used to call the free world and the United States as leader of that free world and those who hope to belong to it and the rest. The United States is widely perceived currently to be in retreat from that position of leadership. Again, leadership of what we used to call the free world. This is a bit of a step back for me, as Frank noted, to what I sometimes call my prior lifestyle, having focused really on the Middle East and Iran affairs and such for quite a long time now, certainly since 9/11. But this is what I did. This was my focus for the first 20 years of my career with the agency, and I was indeed a Russia-focused operations officer. So during that time, which neatly kind of spanned 10 years of the end of the Cold War, and including 10 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, so it was a very interesting period to serve, to say the least. But at that time, and for that entire 20 years, the United States was perceived to be the leader of the free world. We were the leader of the free world and the hope and the aspiration of those who hope to be part of that free world. And of course, during that time, we were working with and hoping to meet the aspirations, help and encourage the aspirations of those caught behind the famous Iron Curtain, as Churchill called it, that came down after World War II. So what we are looking at now is this perception that the United States has very much stepped back, and deliberately, not because we lack the power, not because we lack the resources, but because our leadership has chosen for us to step back, to step down, and to diminish the projection of American power, influence, and of course the example of American freedom and democracy around the world. And now what are we up against? Well, we are up against a KGB thug by the name of Putin. He was a colonel in the KGB before he came to politics and to leadership of Russia. He lived in a time very similar to maybe many of our lifetimes. His lifetime spanned the same. He witnessed the dissolution of the USSR, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the loss of territory, the rise of states that formerly were vassal states. I mean, literally in that sense, vassal states, including Ukraine and all the others that became now independent republics on a co-equal national sovereignty basis with Russia. He witnessed that. He witnessed the collapse of communism, the ideology that had guided his life and the history of the Soviet Union for so many years and decades. He witnessed an economic implosion of communism, which was a large part about why it collapsed in the first place, and then followed by an absolute economic free-for-all as those with the power grabbed for every asset that was available to be grabbed in Russia. Putin came to power sometime after that, but he called that period of collapse, these are his words, he said, quote, "That was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century when the USSR collapsed." This is how he thinks about things. This is how he thinks about the loss of that evil empire, that it was the greatest tragedy. Okay, not World War I with the loss of millions of the finest and the best young men of Europe. Not with the famine, the engineered famine in the Ukraine, where millions were deliberately starved to death. Not World War II with its massive loss of life. None of those, but rather the collapse of the Soviet Union is what he thought was the worst tragedy of the 20th century. He came into prominence and into power with a dedication, a determination to restore that prominence and that power for Russia. And so looking at him in that perspective, we can perhaps see why he is on the course he is on, and understand that he's not going to be deterred by, as Seb mentioned, discussions about constitutions or sovereignty or borders. He is determined to restore the power of the Soviet Union, now Russia. He has never stopped being a KGB colonel. What we have in the Kremlin is a KGB kleptocracy right now, a plutocracy, if you will, but certainly a KGB-controlled and directed kleptocracy, and Putin has dominated that since about the year 2000. He's not going away anytime soon. Let's look at this from a perspective, three different perspectives I want to touch on very quickly here. Geography, ideology, and power, or the balance of power, really. When I said this exists, or what is happening in the Crimea is happening on a continuum, let's look back. Seb mentioned, or Herb mentioned, I think, the grab for the Transnistria. That happened a long time ago. That was the first. Then came the seizure in 2008 of two provinces of Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Now we have the grab for Crimea. Okay, it is piece after piece after piece, trying to get it back into the fold, back into the under the domination and the thumb of Russia, of the Kremlin. What is next? Okay, if we do not make a stand here, we did not make a stand for Georgia, we did not make a stand for Transnistria. The troops of Russia are still in the Transnistria. South Ossetia and Abkhazia are gone from Georgia. If we don't make a stand, this will happen again. There are other areas of the borderland around Russia. And by the way, that's what Ukraine means in the Slavic language of Ukrainian. Ukraina is at the borderland, at the outer outskirts of, in this case, the empire, the rule of Moscow. That is how they look at it, and they look at these areas, including Ukraine, Eastern Europe, that used to be under their domination, the Baltics, Kaliningrad, as part of a buffer zone that Russia, that Moscow, that Putin wants to grab back into his orbit, under his control. Ideology, very quickly. Everything that Putin stands for and is working to reinstate for Russia is antithetical to the values that you just heard Seb talk about, that are our values and our principles. Putin, make no mistake, he is anti-US, he is anti-West, he is anti-Europe. He fears the attraction that freedom, civil society, and rule of law have, that the attraction that they have and they hold for the people of Ukraine, of Crimea, and of these other states in the border areas between the West and the East. He knows that they are antithetical to our own values, and he knows that they are attractive to people who want to be free and to live free of domination. Let's look at the history, not just in those border areas, Eastern Europe, but the Soviet Union and then Russia, also through the KGB, through such renowned, maybe I can call it, former leaders of the KGB like Yevgeny Primakov, who we know about his actions in inciting Arab and Islamic terrorism in the Middle East, using Islamic and Arab terrorism for their own purposes. We know about that from many sources, but one in particular I would recommend to you, and that is Ioan Pacepa. Ioan Pacepa was the former director of the Romanian intelligence service who defected to the West, one of the most important defections that ever occurred, and he has told us about the Soviet Union and the Russian involvement in things like incitement of terror among Islamic and Arab states. New book that he has out, I would recommend to you also. I'm not plugging his book, but this is a very good one. disinformation it's called. And that is the next point that I wanted to make, desinformatia in Russian. This is about information operations. It's about the shaping and the perception of what is going on. The Russians are so good at this. Influence operations. This is not a takeover. This is defense of the Russian language-speaking people of Crimea and so forth. That is information operations. Finally, one last column that I wanted to talk about, topic power, or the balance of power. Russia is a declining power. In every way you can look at it, demographically, militarily, economically, it's in decline and they know it. Demographically, Russia is in a demographic death spiral. Their birth rate at the moment is something like 1.2, that is births per woman per lifetime. There's a certain level at which mathematical certainties take over and they cannot recover. The Slavic population of Russia will disappear. They know it. They don't have a whole lot of time left. 9 out of 10 pregnancies in Russia right now end in abortion. That is not happening among the Muslim population of Russia and the borderlands, let's say, of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and so forth. It is happening among the Slavic population. Militarily, Russia is a hollow military force and increasingly dominated by Muslim conscripts. It is no longer going to be, in the very near future, a majority Slavic army in any case. Economically, on the skids, going down the tubes, even with its humongous wealth in oil and gas. I will finish here with just one last, perhaps, point for you to consider, and that is that the United States has these powers very much right now. We are an economic power. We are demographically viable. We are a military power, but we're not acting like it. And where there is a vacuum, where power such as ours, leadership of the free world, recedes, steps back, willingly giving it up when we ought to be promoting the most successful way of life for the most people on earth that has ever occurred, we are falling back. Where that happens, where we step back, others will be ready to step in, and that is Putin right now, opportunistic at this moment, stepping into the vacuum left by the United States, retreating from a leadership position in the world. Thank you.